Chapter 21. Missing. Carson Drew was dictating letters. Much important work had been neglected by his absorption in Sadie's case, and he was trying to catch up with his correspondence after seeing Nancy and Sadie off on their quest at the old house. High in River Heights' most important office building was Mr. Drew's office, and as he dictated to his efficient secretary, his eyes wandered over the rolling hills that met the river. A knock at the door of the outer office did not interrupt Mr. Drew. He had given orders to his staff that he should not be disturbed. "Excuse me, Mr. Drew," the office boy said, hesitatingly poking his head into the private office. "Excuse me, but Mr. Cochran is outside, and he says he has to talk to you." "Mr. Cochran? Show him in at once," Carson Drew exclaimed. "That will do, Miss Farley. I'll call you when I wish to continue." Mr. Drew awaited Mr. Cochran's entrance with interest, because he was the lawyer retained by the disappointed heirs to break Asa Sidney's will and to deprive Sadie of her inheritance. "Sit down, Mr. Cochran," Carson Drew said pleasantly. "Thanks. I hope you'll excuse me for insisting upon seeing you. As a lawyer, you will realize that this visit is rather unusual. We are opponents, technically speaking," Mr. Cochran began. "An unusual case," was Mr. Drew's guarded comment. "Unusual? If you say it is unusual from your side, I wonder what you would think of it if you were in my position," the visiting lawyer said with a wry smile. "Mind you, I think a good case could be made out for the practically disinherited relatives, but I really don't relish the job very much. The people I represent are so suspicious of each other that I begin to suspect the sincerity of their claims against your client. That is speaking very frankly." "It is," Mr. Drew smiled. "I suppose you will attempt to prove, if this case comes to court, that Mr. Sidney was not in his right mind and was unduly influenced by Miss Whipple to the extent that he left his fortune to the orphan waitress and his loving relatives were cheated." Cochran smiled wryly. "I realized fully that a lawyer of your experience would anticipate the tactics of the opposition," he said formally. "That, of course, is what the plaintiffs wish to have proven. Now I have come to make you a proposition, Mr. Drew. It would save your client unpleasant notoriety if this case were settled out of court. Can't we come to some agreement?" "I don't think so," Mr. Drew said quietly. "Miss Whipple's case is a just and honest one, or else I would not be representing her. We are prepared to contest the unfair claims of the Boontons and the Sidneys, and there can be no compromise." "Well, I have done my duty," Cochran said. "Now, speaking as man to man and not as lawyer to lawyer, I must confess I wish I hadn't taken the case. Whether their claims are good or weak, my clients scarcely inspire me to enter the lists for them with any great enthusiasm." "Then, if I were in your position, I should withdraw," Mr. Drew said tersely. "I don't want to be called a quitter," Cochran said. "Besides, I think my clients are legally right, even if they are not very pleasant and agreeable." The two lawyers arose as Cochran prepared to depart. They turned their heads toward the outer office as the sounds of heated argument came to them through the doors. "What can that be?" Mr. Drew asked, pressing a bell button to summon his secretary. "They are Mr. Sidney and Mr. Boonton," she reported, and with that the door burst open and the two men named came into the office. "This is rather an intrusion," Mr. Drew said, confronting the excited cousins across his desk. "That's all right," Boonton replied. "I am not going to be cheated out of my just rights. I saw Jacob come into the building and I followed him just to see what he was up to, and he comes here to the office of the attorney for the fortune-hunting Sadie. And who else is here? Jeffrey Cochran, the lawyer I was led to hire to protect my interests and that of my niece. It looks funny." "Be quiet," Boonton roared. "I was getting a haircut across the street when I saw Cochran rush in here, so I came on up to Drew's office on a hunch." "What do you mean, anyhow?" Cochran asked. "I came up to ask Mr. Drew if he would consider a settlement out of court." "Well, I hope Drew turned you down," Jacob Sidney fumed. "Our case is good. We don't have to be afraid of any money-seeking waitress. We hired you because we heard you were good at breaking down witnesses, not because you were good at dodging work." Cochran's face flushed, and he slammed Mr. Drew's desk with his fist. "That settles it," he thundered. "I refuse to take your case. I resign as your lawyer, and it gives me exceedingly great satisfaction to do so." "You were never with us," Jacob Sidney sneered. "We'll get ourselves another lawyer, and we'll carry the case to the highest court in the land before we give up. Sadie Whipple won't have a cent of her stolen money left when we get through, and what's more, she'll be in prison." "I can't permit this vulgar quarreling in my office," Mr. Drew shouted. "Please leave at once." "Yes, get out of here," Cochran seconded. "You couldn't send Miss Whipple to jail, even if you won your case." "Oh, maybe you think we can't send Sadie to jail, hey?" Peter Boonton snapped. "Don't be so sure of that. We've talked this over and the whole business looks pretty bad to us. Pretty bad." "Stop. What do you mean?" Mr. Drew demanded, striding across the room and placing his back against the door. Boonton and Sidney, suspicious of each other as they were, drew close together and confronted the angry lawyers. "I'll tell you what he means," Jacob snarled, his face flushed with rage. "He means that it is a mighty queer thing that right after a visit to old Asa by two young ladies, mentioning no names, he makes his will all of a sudden in favor of one of them and then dies the next day. And the lady who finds him dead is the one that gets his money. If that's not, that is the most infamous accusation I ever listened to," Mr. Drew exclaimed. "Let me warn you that it is you who will be in jail for spreading such base scandal." "And let me add to that, sirs," Cochran shouted, "that not only do I refuse to handle your case, but I hereby offer my full services to Miss Whipple and Miss Drew." What further argument might have taken place was never revealed, because Miss Farley again pushed the door open. "Excuse me, Mr. Drew, but your housekeeper is on the wire, and she insists upon talking with you," the secretary said. "Why, it is getting close to dinner time," Mr. Drew said, glancing at his watch. "I'll speak to her at once." He lifted the receiver of his private telephone, and as he listened, his face grew grave, then decidedly apprehensive. Putting the instrument down, he turned to Cochran. "My daughter and Miss Whipple are missing," he said hoarsely. "They were supposed to have gone to the old house and then to Raymond Hill's office. They cannot be located at either place." End of chapter 21.